big name, big fame, but a dwindling game. That's the story of Ja Morant, and his future in Memphis is coming to an end. Plus, we do a deep dive into the Trae Young trade and what it means for both the Hawks and the Washington Wizards. Plus, a look around the NBA and some possible trades coming before the NBA trade deadline on February 5th. So, without further ado, let's get right to it. What's up, everyone, and welcome in to a special live edition of the Your Celtics Source podcast here on Tuesday evening. A couple of great games coming on later tonight. The Spurs and the Thunder meet once again. I believe it's the fourth time now in the last month or so, maybe a month and a half. And the Spurs, quite frankly, have owned the Thunder for almost the entirety of every game. You know, there's been a couple of quarters where the Thunder have looked good, but for the most part, Victor Wembanyama, Luke Kornet, Fox, Castle, have all just, shined in this matchup. One of the really only teams the Thunder have had trouble with all season. But as I said at the top of the show, I want to talk about, the two biggest pieces of news around the NBA right now. The one is the Trae Young trade that's already happened, and we're already seeing the effects of the trade on both teams that were involved in it. And the other trade, or I guess it's not a trade, but is most likely going to happen, is the Ja Morant situation. And I want to start with that just because I think that one is something that's going to fall out in the next, couple of weeks here. And I'm not even sure if he will get traded despite the Memphis Grizzlies openly shopping him. And, there are a couple of buyers, I think, around the league, as they are with any star player, or at least player of his caliber. I'm not going to say he's a star player with, we're going to get into why I think that. But, let's start with what's going on, right? And Shams reported the other day that the Grizzlies are open to trading him. And why is that? It's because, there's this little bit of an awkwardness with Ja Morant. His value is pretty complicated. First of all, his availability, right? He's never on the floor these days. He's injured. He takes games off sometimes. He has this calf issue right now that he's dealing with, and we all know that calf issues lead directly to Achilles, and that puts you out for pretty much the entire season, right? And there's a increase in Achilles, it feels like, or Achilles tears for that matter, over the last couple of years with the pace of play and just the athleticism of some of these guys in the NBA, right? As a whole, the NBA has gotten really athletic. Even centers. You look at Wemby, right? No center was doing stuff that Wemby was doing back in the day. And, Wemby is definitely an outlier, but there are players like Jokic, like Şengün, players that are, in between a guy like Wemby and some of the guys in the 80s and 90s and even the 2000s in terms of athleticism. Right? His production, Ja Morant, has gone, extremely downhill this season. I think it's probably his worst season of his career. The efficiency's down. The rim pressure is declining, right? He's not getting to the rim as often. He's not dunking the ball as often. And that's a big problem because, he's playing scared, right? And you don't want a player that is playing scared on the court. He's worried about getting injured again. And that's a concern for sure. But with that concern comes the fact that he's just standing out on the court and being a liability on the offensive end for you. Right? I mean, and, to be honest, he's just not fun to watch, right? You look at a guy like Anthony Edwards compared to John Morant here, and they're pretty similar players in my opinion. But Anthony Edwards is leading a top team in the Western Conference. Meanwhile, Ja is sitting on the bench for a team that is under 500, and when he's on the court, he is a shell of himself, right? And then I'm going to get more into the team results in just a second, but I want to take a step back and, look at what's coming up for him. Or I guess the team, right? The team is heading to Europe. This is why it's very confusing why they reported this now, or the Grizzlies, let the rumors seek out that they're open to trading him, because they're heading to Europe for a showcase game in Berlin, and then I think they head to London afterwards. And the NBA is trying to build a reputation, build a fan base in Europe, and you're putting a guy out there in John Morant, who's the star of this matchup, right, the headline for these matchups, as a way to promote the league. And the guy that you're promoting or using to promote is a guy that barely even plays. And when he does play, he's not good. And so I'm really confused on why the Grizzlies would do that, because not only is this going to hurt the NBA's reputation, which, who knows, if he shines and he performs in those games, it'll be fine. But overall, right, you don't want him going out there and, it's one thing if he doesn't have a great game, but it's another thing if he doesn't even play, or, the team plays bad and there's a bad mood around the team. You don't want that, because, he's going to be doing media, availability, of course, before the game. The NBA is going to force him to do that with just a way to promote the league, and there's going to be questions about his long-term status in the NBA, as well as, or not with this team, long-term status with this team, as well as questions about playing in Europe and whatever like that. There'll be the fan base questions, but there'll also be the serious NBA questions, and he's going to have to deal with that while, trying to promote the league at the same time. And that's a hard task to do, right? Especially, right, when the NBA is trying to promote that international business and he has a shoe obligation with Nike, stuff that you don't want to get in the way of his production. But at the moment, with all the stuff he has going for him, he has all these things off the court that are also not helping his case. And as for the team, they're 6-12 when he plays, and just about 500 when he doesn't play, right? So it's not like they're a great team without him. The upside of Ja is obviously going to be better than maybe the floor is higher with him off the court, but definitely the ceiling's higher with him on the court. And at the moment, or at least this season and over the last couple of seasons, when he's played, he just has not looked great. We talked about his efficiency. He's shooting a career, low for three-point shooting, and he's taking, threes like he's a natural three-point shooter. Like, that's his thing that he does. He's, chucking up, 4, 5, 6, 7 sometimes threes a game, and shooting at such a low volume, or shooting at such a low efficiency here, that it's just, just hurting the team in every which way. Jump shooting as well, right? He's, he used to be a guy that, had the obviously the, the highlight-worthy dunks and whatever, and, posterizers, and then you'd also have, his ability to shoot mid-range and fade away contested twos, and you're just getting none of that right now. And he's very similar to a guy like, Trae Young, like Luka Doncic to a lesser degree, because Luka obviously has a much higher offensive ceiling. But LaMelo Ball is in that same category. These guys that, have great offensive potential, sometimes struggle on the defensive end in the case of LaMelo Ball and Trae Young, and a little bit of Luka, although it's been a little bit better as of this season. But, guys that really struggle on the defensive end, hurt teams, but then have such a high offensive potential that you're sort of conflicted on whether you want to play him or you don't. And we know what the Hawks did. We're going to get to that. They moved on from him or from Trae Young. And the Grizzlies are sort of in that same boat. Plus, they have the other, social side of that, right? The fact that, he has been suspended for 25 games or whatever it was for the gun incident. He, the second he came back, he tore his shoulder and was out, right? So you have the injury concerns compiled with the mental side of it and the social side, the fact that you don't want to have that sort of lingering over your team. And these two things make it very hard to keep a player like that despite his potential offensive production, even if he can get it around in years to come, right? And the problem is that, when I say it sort of feels like a distressed asset, right? The fact that, we compare him to Trae Young and we saw the market that Trae Young got, there's a very little market for, offensive only guys, because this league values athleticism, two-way status as a player, and just basically above all the ability to not be a just disaster on the defensive end, because it doesn't matter how good your offense is if you are being just attacked every single time down the court on defense. They're counterproductive there. You need, all defensive players have a little bit of offense in them that you can get whenever you want. And offense obviously is the hardest, part to master, or I guess the hardest skills to, to master, right? And, players that are natural born scorers, get paid the most in this league. That's just how it works. Because, offensive players like that are so hard to come by. But that being said, the players that are making the difference on teams are the two-way players, the two-way role players or star players, right? You look at Jaylen Brown, yes, they've struggled, the Celtics, and we're not going to make this about the Celtics, but they have struggled as of recently a little bit, but for the most part, they've been so good this season because of the two-way ability of Jaylen Brown, Derek White, whoever's on the court, right? Shea is still a fantastic defensive player. He's not even the best defensive player on that team. But he's not a complete liability on that end of the floor, right? And, I think another fact is, few teams need a point guard like that. Of these teams that can absorb $40 million in salary cap, even fewer of those, have the ability, or of those teams that can take on 40 million, fewer of those teams, want a guy like that or have that need for a point guard, right? And with today's salary cap, rules, very few teams will just take on a $40 million contract and see what happens. You have to be so sure that it's going to work out for the future of your team, and the path and direction you want to take as a franchise, right? And does Memphis have to trade him? I think so. I think that the feeling is pretty mutual. John Morant wants a new situation, a new culture that he can be a part of. Same with the Grizzlies. The locker room is in dysfunction. We'll see what happens on this Europe trip. It could be a success on the outside for the NBA, but inside, the team could be just in complete shambles. We'll see what happens. And the longer they keep on, the longer they, keep a hold of him, he is going to, if his, production continues to stay like it is, the smaller and smaller his, potential returnings could be. And the Grizzlies do want to start over and build around a young core in Triple J. And they got rid of Desmond Bane this summer, but they want to keep a hold of Edey in some of their young talent that they have right now. And I'm gonna move on to the Trae Young trade. Um, I think both these players are two players that we saw what the Hawks got back for Trae Young, right? Just a couple picks or a couple players on pretty poor salaries compared to their production. They got very few picks. I don't think the Hawks got any picks actually, if I'm not mistaken, right? So, and I believe actually that the Grizzlies are going to get less than that because I think in the end, Trae Young's actually a better player than Ja Morant is at this stage. Yeah, moving on to the Trae Young trade. We've talked about it a little bit before, but I want to do a big in-depth dive of this game or of this trade. And, very similar to Ja Morant, Trae Young is viewed as a negative asset. And the reasons for this, right? We know that the defense just collapses when he's on the floor. Teams just attack him on every single possession. The team has, a losing record with him on the court, very similar to a Ja Morant, and, are actually much better with him off the court compared to the Memphis Grizzlies. There's a lot more talent, obviously, around Trae Young on that, or there was a lot more talent around him and Jalen Johnson and other guys, on that team. And they thought it was going to work out this season with Porzingis coming from the Celtics, but with Porzingis being, basically sick all season with the illness and whatever that he faced last season as well, there was no way to hold on to Trae Young. And the fact that his contract is just way too big for his offensive-only production. And we talked about the records when they're split, or the record split when he plays and when he doesn't play. And the team just believed that they were better off without him. I think another part of this is the fact that the Hawks don't own their pick in 2025, right? They have an incentive to win now, because you don't want to, give another team a good pick if you don't have to, right? You want to win as many games as you can right now. Get into the play-in, see if you can, make some noise in the first round of the playoffs. There's a pivot forward around Jalen Johnson, as I had said. What else? Length, defense, versatility that he brings. And the Hawks have had other problems. Zachary Risochet has not been good when he's been on the floor this season. But, Trae's injuries as well, the knee sprain, he had a thigh contusion, I think, as well this season. And just, it just added to the fact that, he was no longer going to be a great fit on this team. That's the Hawks side of it. The Washington Wizards side of it is really confusing. And it's confusing for the fact that the logic for getting him very much contradicts the plans for the Washington Wizards this season, right? They took on his contract knowing that they have a top 8 protected pick and they need to lose games this season. They need to lose games to get, as best pick as possible. Try and get a guy like AJ DeBansa or whoever it is coming out of college, right? They are on a path trying to lose as many games as possible. And, we talked about the Washington Wizards, or Trae Young and his defense and how it's, a nightmare for the Hawks. But the Washington Wizards don't play any defense anyway. And they've been, when I say just fine, obviously they've been a terrible team this year. But they haven't been the worst team in the league. And quite frankly, their offense isn't that bad. And I think with Trae Young, they would win too many games. Trae Young just adds an upside that he brings offensively that's going to win you some games. And you put Trae Young around some of these players, and you could, get production out of them that you're not normally getting with a guy that can just generate gravity towards him and get guys open shots, stuff that you don't want if you're the Wizards. Well, I say they don't want, to be winning these games. But on the flip side of that, they get Trae Young for the sole reason of trying to, develop these young players. Put a guy around there that is at this point, a veteran in the NBA that knows how to run an offense. And yes, he has his own system, but, he can get some of these young Washington Wizards, key looks, key, sort of plays on the ball, shooting practice that they need to get the Washington Wizards in a state where they can be contending for championships, right? You have a lot of young talent, and they're hopefully trying to get another pick this season. But that being said, you have too many young guys that are not developing on a team that is losing every single night by 10, 15 points sometimes, as an average, right? And Trae Young can help to fix that. And we talked about, Trae Young is not just a pure, good stats, bad team player. He does, in the past have some winning with him. 2021 specifically is probably, his peak career where he led the team as far as he did until they lost to the Bucks. I think it was conference finals that they went to. But, right, we talked about, the fact that the Washington Wizards, they don't want to win. And I actually don't think they'll play him very much. Obviously, I think he is injured right now. Maybe not. But he hasn't played a game yet. And the Washington Wizards don't intend on playing him. So you got a guy that it has a $40 million contract. It's expiring at the end of the year. I think they'll probably sign a new contract for him. It's not going to be $40 million for sure. But they'll sign a long-term contract for him. But they might not. They might just let him walk at the end of the season. And at that point, why'd you take on that salary? Why'd you do that just to not play him and let him go at the end of the season? Just a really bizarre scenario for Washington. A trade that just didn't make sense, in my opinion, if you're not going to play him. It makes a lot of sense if you're going to play him and develop guys. But the Washington Wizards don't want to win. And, we can talk about tanking, and that's a whole different story, and what the NBA should do to try and limit, tanking in the NBA. As I see it, it's just something that has to happen. And I don't, quite frankly, the NFL doesn't have a problem with tanking. No other league has a problem with tanking. Teams tank, openly tank. They sit guys, whatever. You look at the Raiders this season, sitting Crosby, sitting, what's the other defensive guy there for the Raiders? But whatever, right? You see them sitting guys, and the league has no problem with it. Why does the NBA have a problem with teams tanking? I don't understand that. Just let it happen. Nobody wants to watch those teams anyway, whether they're, a good team or not. Right? If they're just an average, pretty bad team, it doesn't, nobody's watching the Washington Wizards. Actually, that's another topic on the Washington Wizards. Trae Young might do something that the Washington Wizards desperately need. And that's, if he plays, that is. And that's just putting fans in the stands, right? The Washington Wizards have had the lowest attendance over the last couple of years. They have almost, of those fans, they have almost no fans that are supporting that team. And maybe having a superstar, quote unquote, can, put some money in that team, put some ticket sales that the Washington Wizards desperately need. We talked about the similarities between him and a LaMelo Ball and a John Morant, Luka to a lesser degree, as I had said. And we talked about the Wizards' dilemma. And I want to go through in just a second. We're going to move on from these two topics and, look at the league as a whole. And we're actually going to run through almost every team and talk about a potential, off-season move that they could make. we actually are, closing up on almost 30 minutes, so we are going to run through those pretty quickly. There are definitely some teams that I left out because, we're going to do a full show on them at some point later in the season as probably part of a Celtics podcast where we also talk about Celtics games and whatever. Those include Milwaukee, right? Who knows what's going to happen with Giannis? I think he's going to stay, but we don't really know. There's some other teams that, have, interesting or maybe potential moves that they could make, but they might wait till the offseason. And then some of those top teams, the Knicks, Wolves, Nuggets, Spurs, Pistons, Thunder, all those top teams, I didn't, want to go into in this episode, just because I thought that, I'm not sure what they're going to do because they all need, different things that are small, little minor tweaks. They're not big moves that could shape up the NBA. So I didn't think that this was the right episode to go over that stuff. Final thought on the John Morant and Trae Young trade is I think we see that with the Luka trade, with the Trae Young trade, these, moves for quote unquote superstars are not out of the question. And sometimes you just need a change of scenery. And I think that's going to work really well for Trae Young. I know he's on a team that is a struggling team. And the Memphis Grizzlies, have been a better run organization than the Washington Wizards, right? So I think there's, more of an incentive to keep John Morant than there was for Atlanta. For Atlanta to keep Trae Young. But that being said, John Morant brings those other issues to the floor that you can't undo. But we're gonna move on here. First, let me tell you, it'd mean a lot if you could go down, hit that subscribe button, hop into the chat here. We will talk about any of the comments that you guys bring up. We can talk about really anything you guys want here as we continue on here. Follow on social media. I have a new Instagram account that I had to create as my other one got deleted for some reason. Really bizarre. Not sure how that happened. So please go and follow there. We post highlights, content, all sorts of stuff all week long, 24/7 really. We do a instant reaction after every Celtics game. You can go check out the one last night after the Celtics, just basically fell apart against the Indiana Pacers of all team. They were without Jaylen Brown. After every 3 games, we do a podcast episode. Unless we're doing a bonus one like this, either live or sometimes just pre-recorded. If there's interesting things to talk about, we'll do a bonus episode. So lots of content all season long. And then as we get closer to the trade deadline and then into the playoffs and whatever, All-Star break, the schedule will change a little bit. We'll have live post-game shows. We'll do live watch parties, all of that stuff. So stay tuned for that. Your support is really appreciated. And then thank you guys so much once again. By the way, you can check out all of these podcast episodes, not the game reactions, but the podcast episodes on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, wherever you get your podcasts. After they are recorded or after I'm finished with this live stream, I will upload it to those platforms for you guys to enjoy in audio format. But let's move on to some of the moves that teams could make around the NBA. And I think the best way to do this is start with the worst team and work our way up. And as I said, I only have a couple of notes on each of these teams. Some teams I just decided to skip overall. Without further ado, let's start with the New Orleans Pelicans. And if you're the New Orleans Pelicans, I'm not sure what you do about Zion Williamson. He's an all-world talent, but that's when he's on the floor. And that's a big but. He's been pretty injured over his career. It seems like he's never on the floor. When he is on the floor, he's been pretty solid, but it hasn't coincided with winnings, and I think a lot of that is just the consistency. he hasn't been, as bad as a guy like John Morant or Trae Young when he's on the floor. Quite frankly, he's been pretty good and a great watch when he's playing. But I think the consistency and the camaraderie, in the fact that he doesn't play much, has hurt the Pelicans. And unfortunately, they have no incentive to lose. They have no incentive to lose. They want to continue to keep winning here because they don't hold their own pick. I'm not quite sure on who their pick goes to, but I'm expecting them probably to not do much at the trade deadline. Zion Williamson is probably an off-season thing if they really wanted to get rid of him. Personally, I wouldn't. I would just try and continue to lose games here and get a top pick if you can, and start to build around those two players. All right, the Pacers. Another team that I think is probably going to stand pat, and that's because Halliburton's out for the season. You got rid of so many good players in the offseason. You're going to get, hopefully a good lottery pick. And, they did have that win last night against the Celtics. And unfortunately, that doesn't help their case. But I think, you just stay on pat and try and get a pick to build around Halliburton and whoever they draft. Right, and obviously you have Pascal Siakam or whatever. This team is going to be right back in the mix next season if Halliburton, is back and, playing like he was last season, because he, just those two guys alone was a talent and a scene to behold. Sacramento. Sabonis is injured. They have, quite frankly, been a team that has, for the most part, looked like a lottery team, but then you have big wins against the Rockets like they had on Sunday, and I think they had another game early on where they've looked good. So pretty, wild games where, very similar. Anyone can win on any night. Very similar to the Pacers where, for the most part, they've been a pretty poor team, and then they'll have those occasional games where they show out and perform. And like, Zion Williamson, Sabonis is probably a guy that gets traded in the offseason just because he's going to be out for many weeks with the injury. And probably more likely to get traded than Williamson is. But, we'll have to wait and see. Washington Wizards, we talked about them. That's probably the only move they make. Brooklyn Nets, maybe Michael Porter Jr. I think they have the most salary cap space in the NBA. And quite frankly, they got to start putting that to use. Because I know they had 5 first-round draft picks last year, and this year they're hopefully going to get a lottery pick. Although they've won, a couple games here over the last, month or so that hasn't helped their case. And quite frankly, I actually think they're trying to win games despite being bad. There are other franchises, Washington Wizards, Pacers this season, that are not trying to win games. But the Nets are trying to win games, and they're still not doing that. They just don't have the talent. Michael Porter Jr. Could be a good trade asset this season. There's actually a team that I think he would be great on that we're going to talk about later. Charlotte Hornets. This is just my hope. I don't think it's going to happen. It's, my dream is that, LaMelo Ball, gets traded. He's a better version of Trae Young, as we mentioned earlier. He's a brilliant offensive player. He has his own system and game that is not great. And I don't think you're going to be able to, work that out of him. But, LaMelo Ball could be a player that you could put on your team. Maybe not as your star player, but as a shooter. And unfortunately, I don't know if that's going to happen. There's not many guys that are going to want a LaMelo Ball similar to Trae Young or John Morant. But that's just my hope. All right. The Utah Jazz. I think Lauri Markkanen makes too much to be traded, more of an off-season thing where you can, have more time to work out salaries and do, multiple team trades and stuff like that if you need. Right, he signed a large contract knowing that there was going to be a lot of losing in Utah and that he would have to sit through it. He's not even playing. Right, the NBA has fined the Jazz multiple times over the last couple of seasons for just sitting their star players. Trying to lose games. They have not lucked out in getting a high draft pick in the top 3 over the last many years. All right, Dallas Mavericks. AD is injured. I would have loved to see him go to the Hawks. I don't even know if he's going to play again this season. My guess is he would have been traded, but now that he, is, probably most likely going to sit out the whole season, and we have Kyrie coming back at some point, I'm wondering if they don't even trade him this offseason, see if they can put, a winning team together with, Cooper Flag, AD, and Kyrie Irving. Because I actually think, when all healthy, that's a great, fantastic team. A championship caliber team. But they all have to be healthy, and who knows if that's going to ever happen. The Clippers, they've played well as of recently. They're up to 11th in the Western Conference. I think they need to get into the playoffs. Maybe not the playoffs, but yeah, maybe the playoffs, but the play-in tournament at least. I think their pick goes to OKC if they're, a bottom, if it's lower than 7th in the NBA, I believe it is. Right now, they're not, which is a good thing, because we all know we don't want that pick going to OKC. But that being said, right, they continue to win. Kawhi has looked good. He's been healthy as of recently. We know when the playoffs come along, he won't be healthy, because that's just how it is with Kawhi. But James Harden has looked good, and it'd actually be nice to see that team continue to keep winning despite Chris Paul not being there anymore. Milwaukee, I think we'll revisit the Giannis trade in the offseason. He's definitely not going to be traded at the trade deadline here. He said so himself that he doesn't want to be traded. Who knows if he's just, blowing smoke or not, but definitely, it's not going to happen at this trade deadline. All right, we're going to run through some teams here quickly. We already talked about Memphis. The Blazers and the Bulls are pretty similar teams. I think the Bulls need to lose some more games because, quite frankly, being an annually 39-win team, and 10th place in the Eastern Conference isn't doing you any good because you're not getting good lottery draft odds, and you're not good enough to go anywhere in the playoffs. They need to lose games. They need to reset their team and be a team that can, tank for a season, get a high pick, and restart their system. Being a 39-win team doesn't do anything for you in the NBA. And we'll see what the Bulls do. If I were the Bulls, and they're obviously gonna probably be like the 10th seed in the Eastern Conference again, I would just sit everyone in the play-in tournament, purposely lose that game, see if you can get lucky with some odds like the Dallas Mavericks did last season. But then next season, go right ahead and tank the whole season. The Miami Heat, Tyler Hero and Bam Adebayo. I don't think Bam Adebayo is a franchise center anymore. He's still a great starting caliber center. The Celtics could use a guy like that for sure. There are a lot of teams that could use a guy like Bam Adebayo. But the offense shouldn't be running through him anymore. He shouldn't be the offensive engine. He should be a solid number 2 guy, or even number 3 guy on this team, or on a team. I think you build around Tyler Hero if you're the Miami Heat. The Warriors. The biggest question marks around this team. Older players struggling, besides Steph Curry. It's a 500 team. Draymond Green, could possibly be on the table. I think it's pretty unlikely. But this has been a team that has underachieved, a team that we thought was going to be a solid playoff team, and they look like an old and veteran team where the title contention dynasty is pretty much at the end of its course. Cleveland, injuries. That's the story of this team, right? They're not going anywhere, or they're not going to do much at the trade deadline. They just got to get healthy because they're a top team in the Eastern Conference, if not the NBA, when they're healthy. But they just have not been. Orlando, injuries as well. Philly. Tyrese Maxey has been unbelievable this year. He's a top 5 points per game scorer. I think he's like 3 or something like that. He's an MVP candidate for sure. This team is 5th, I believe, in the East. Paul George has found a role. Joel Embiid has had games where he looks great. He's also had some games where he struggles. But this team is, winning in spite of Embiid, because of Tyrese Maxey. The Suns and the Raptors, they're pretty much in the same boat. Good defense for the Raptors, good offense for the Suns. Both have solid opposites, right? So the offense for the Raptors is okay, although they get a lot of their offense on their defense and transition, whatever. And then the Suns' defense is much better than last season. It's able to hold its own for sure. We talked about, we're going to skip Boston, actually. The Los Angeles Lakers, shooting struggles have been the biggest problem for them right now, and why they, have a negative net rating, and they're still, I think they're 7th now. No, they're probably, I think they're 6th maybe in the West, maybe 5th. As I check here, they are, if I'm not mistaken, they are, 6th, 7th overall, and then in the conference, they are 5th. But we see they can't hold up their own defensively or athletically against some of the, better teams in the NBA. They dominate, poor teams, and then they struggle mightily against top teams in the NBA, even when everyone's healthy. And obviously Austin Reeves has been out, and that's, hurt them a little bit. But they still should be winning games with Luka and LeBron, despite LeBron being 42 and not the player that he used to be. Right? Luka is putting up wildly, inefficient shooting percentages. He's getting his points, but the low percentages is really hurting the team offensively. And, they don't have a center. There's not a lot of centers in the NBA that are not, locked to a team. The Celtics found that out this offseason and are finding it out this season. Jackson Hayes, or, for the Lakers, what's his name? For their center, why am I blanking on his name? Ayton, right? DeAndre Ayton, right? He's definitely not a high caliber center in any way. I'm not gonna do much with the teams above, as I had already talked about before going into this segment. The last big team I want to talk about here is the Detroit Pistons. They could use a 3-point shooter that you can put around this already great defensive team. You can give up one of your defensive players in exchange for an offensive player, because they could use a guy like that around Cade Cunningham. They are missing a 3-point shooter mightily that could put them over the top in the Eastern Conference, right? And this is the year. With JT out, he might come back. I mean, I think he is going to come back. That's a topic for another show. But he's going to come back. But this is the year where, if you can get that 3-point shooter to put around Cade Cunningham in this already elite defense, you put yourself in a good place to beat the Celtics, the Knicks, or whoever else. You have to go up and get to the finals, a run where I think they're going to be the first seed in the Eastern Conference. And they're going to have to play probably pretty much the Celtics or the Knicks, depending on, how far each of those teams make it. I'm a little bit worried about the Celtics, but, it could be a totally different team by then with Tatum. But, I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm going to save those top teams for a different time. I want to thank you guys once again for watching the show. Your support is extremely helpful, and I'm grateful for all of that. As I said, you can find this podcast on Apple, Amazon, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. We will be, I'll have another instant reaction after the Celtics game against the Miami Heat on Thursday, and then we play the Hawks on Saturday. The Hawks without Trae Young, so we'll have an instant reaction after that. We actually might go live for the game with a live stream watch party for the game. We might have a live post game show as well, and then Sunday morning, hopefully earlier than last Sunday's episode came out. But hopefully Sunday morning we will have a new podcast episode that'll be 3 games since my last traditional podcast episode. Just about a week, because they're playing about 3 games a week. It lines up that they're playing, or the podcast episodes are coming out every Sunday right now. We're gonna talk about some of these games. We're going to preview Texans Patriots. Almost said Chargers there. Texans Patriots. And a defensive battle that the Drake May and the Patriots are gonna have to go up against. But until next time, go Celtics, go Patriots, and hopefully the Red Sox can spend a dime this offseason, because it's getting pretty frustrating.